Well, good day to you all. Nice to have you with us on our great session today, Impacts of COVID-19 in ASEM's Connectivity Agenda. My name's George Cunningham, and I'm the European Union Alternate Senior Official for ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting. And we have three wonderful speakers for you today. We have Hwee from the European Union Centre in Singapore. We have Tonchev Plamen of the Institute of International Economic Relations. He's based in Athens. And Maaike Okano-Hejmans, Netherlands Institute for International Relations, Clingendael. So I just want to welcome our speakers. I hope you're having a good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. So nice to have you all here. So ASEM, I'm just going to give a short introduction. As you know, you're attending a meeting of ASEM, an ASEM forum. ASEM, it consists of, very briefly, 51 countries, plus the European Union and ASEAN secretariats. It's a very informal gathering of people. There is no secretariat or organization behind it, and it's very unique because this is the forum where Asia-Europe meets. In fact, next year will be the 75th anniversary, 25th anniversary of ASEM. So looking forward to that. And we'll be having our next summit, which is the 13th summit in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, in the middle of, roughly the middle of next year. So looking forward to that very much. The summits are held on a biannual basis, once every 2 years. And in between those years, you have a foreign ministers meeting. And ASEM is organized into 3 regional groupings. European grouping, which is 30 out of the 53. Then you have ASEAN, which is 10, plus ASEAN Secretariat, and the rest is Northeast and South Asia, NESA group. And it was the foreign ministers in Cambodia that just recently did a statement on COVID-19, which showed the actions that ASEM is taking to fight this terrible disease. So let's have the video, it's just 1 minute long, on that. Yes, so that statement came out. It was an unusual statement because normally the statements come out when we have a summit or we have a ministerial meeting, foreign ministerial meeting. But in this particular case, because of the delay in the ASEM summit being delayed by 6 months because of COVID-19, there was what we call the intersessional statement. And it was unusually done by 5 foreign ministers as opposed to being done by the heads of state, 53, or the heads of all foreign ministers, 53. So have a look at that if you want to see the sort of things that we've been doing on COVID-19, and also what is the principles behind what we're trying to do as we move together forward, Asia and Europe, in coordination with each other. Now, the purpose of the meeting today is to do with, as usual, connectivity. As you know, connectivity has become a central theme within ASEM. It's led to an animated exchange and a final agreement on an ASEM sustainable connectivity definition some 3 years ago. And it's an international reference on what is connectivity, covering all modes of transport, such as institutions, infrastructure, financial corporations, cultural exchanges, customs, trade and investment, as well as having core principles such as level playing field, market principles, inclusiveness, fairness, openness, transparency, cost effectiveness, mutual benefits. And it contributes to the materialization of the principles, goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this is what this session is all about, is how COVID-19 is affecting this agenda. So first of all, we have the great honor to have Hwee from the European Union Center in Singapore to give us more details about that, followed by Plamen, who will go into what COVID-19 is doing to this agenda, and then Maaike to look at digital in particular, which is a great speciality. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the three of them. Hwee, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for the introduction to ASEM process. You took out half of my presentation already, so.
Hell.
But anyway, good morning to friends and colleagues in Europe, and good afternoon to those who are from Asia. My name is Hwee Hwee, which is usually how I prefer to refer myself with my surname first. I'm the director of the EU Center, and I've been following the ASEM process since its very beginning. So as I've also said in an earlier panel discussion in this conference, my expertise is really more on Asia-Europe, not so much on the connectivity side of things. So I'm glad to have Maaike here to join us to tell us more about digital connectivity and what and the nuts and bolts of what connectivity is about. So my presentation will take you to a very short tour of how I think the connectivity agenda becomes it becomes an integral part of the ASEM agenda, and how this may or can impact the way, if there is the political will, can impact the way ASEM can function in the years ahead. And of course, the relevance of ASEM to its partner countries. I think George has introduced what ASEM is about. It is ASEM is the acronym for Asia-Europe Meeting, launched in 1996. It was a meeting for the leaders of Europe and Asia, at that time represented by the EU and its member states. And in 1996, there was then only ASEAN, 7 member states of ASEAN, plus China, Japan, and South Korea. When it was conceived, I think there was a big so-called geo-economic objective. We tend to think that geopolitics only starts to become hot now, but when ASEM was conceived, there was this one geo-economic objective, which is to strengthen the weakest link in a global economy that was supposedly powered by 3 engines, right? By 3 engines: America, Europe, and Asia. So the narrative then was that while there are strong connections between America and Europe, and between and strengthening ties between Asia and America through the APEC process, the link between Asia and Europe is missing, and hence needs to be launched or needs to be strengthened. So the inaugural meeting in 1996 was very much just a feel-good summit with emphasis on dialogue, with really no specific agenda, I think. But surprisingly, it did result in a rather enthusiastic commitment to build this partnership through a series of meetings and initiatives. And this, of course, laid the foundation for what we see of ASEM today, which is not just a meeting of the leaders, but a multi-sectoral, multi-level meetings involving various ministries, not just the foreign affairs anymore, but also education, transport, environment, and multi-level in the sense that it's not just the ministers or the politicians that meet, but also officials, technical experts, and all that. And of course, the most important of what came out of the ASEM process is the establishment of the Asia-Europe Foundation. It is the only concrete or brick and mortar institution that arise out of the ASEM forum. And I think the objective behind the Asia-Europe Foundation was really to go beyond government-to-government dialogue, to enlarge the dialogue to civil society, academia, and all that. In that sense, to promote the dialogue between people to people, or what we will call people-to-people connections now, right? Since the connectivity agenda is so much in our lexicon or in our jargon now. So the expansion, so ASEM, of course, as George has told you, has now expanded to, I think, comprising 53 partners or members. But this expansion in number of meetings and in a membership within ASEM did not really lead to any tangible cooperation or concrete outcomes. So fundamentally, ASEM remained very much a dialogue, a forum for dialogue. But it was also perhaps, and it has been discussed in the ASEM process, I think since 2016, when they were reviewing so-called 10 years of ASEM, there's always this a sense from some members that ASEM should not just be a dialogue forum, there should be something more tangible coming out of it. We should see some tangible or concrete results and from the ASEM forum, from the process. But this has been an ongoing sort of discussion, but which really never lead to anywhere further than constant talk about there should be more tangible and concrete results out of this ASEM process. So what is connectivity? Now I've told you a little bit about ASEM and how is it understood within the ASEM framework. As I said, if we want to take a very dispassionate look at connectivity, it simply means the state of being connected, right? And I mentioned that. But once this kind of word is applied in the context of international politics and relations, then of course it takes on different nuances and interpretation. For me, who comes from Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has for ASEAN, for instance, this is what connectivity really was, which was introduced in the 2010 master plan, or ASEAN master plan on connectivity, was to be the path that needs to be taken towards building a ASEAN community. So it was in some way this word connectivity that was used in the ASEAN context emphasized the technocratic aspect of community building, like what the EU used to say, right? Is this good old functional way of approach towards regional integration? Because ASEAN in 2010 has launched this huge process about wanting to achieve an ASEAN community by 2015. But there's all these things that need to be done before you can really achieve a community, right? So in order to build an ASEAN community, you must have first a well-connected ASEAN, in the sense that you have good rail links, air links, and sea links, in order to allow the free or facilitate the flow of goods and people. Then you need to have you need to be connected institutionally, in the sense of having certain sets of rules, processes, and mechanisms to facilitate trade and investments, and in particular, important for the flow of capital and services. And henceforth, in the 2010 Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity, it was clearly stated that connectivity comprised the foundational support and facilitative means to achieve the vision of an integrated ASEAN community. Right? So this was what, and then the key elements of ASEAN connectivity then comprise physical connectivity, those in transport, in energy, in communications, then institutional connectivity, as I have mentioned, the agreements on how to harmonize trade rules and standards, and harmonization of standards, and then people-to-people connectivity, which of course refers to education, culture, and tourism. So if we look at back into what ASEAN has been talking, we could see to some extent that the ASEM connectivity agenda is quite similar to the master plan, the ASEAN master plan on ASEAN connectivity, in terms of framing. When ASEAN updated its 2010 master plan to the master plan on ASEAN connectivity 2025, it reoriented the priority areas into 5 strategic areas: sustainable infrastructure, digital innovation, seamless logistics, regulatory excellence, and people mobility. And you can see all these terms being also sort of used in the ASEM. Who influenced who? We can say there is this cross diffusion of lexicons or ideas and that are being used in the context. But from a much more technocratic framing of connectivity by ASEAN, I think connectivity became a very highly politicized concept when the Chinese started to push for its ambitious Belt and Road initiative onto the global stage, in particular into Asia and Europe. And it was also following the launch of the BRI by China that China also began to push for ASEM towards a connectivity agenda. And again, this comes back to the thing about the idea that, oh, ASEM should not be just continue to just be a forum for dialogue, but should really to have that can deliver on much more concrete cooperation and with tangible outcomes. And this is what the Chinese used to say, that we need to have this more focus on things like connectivity that can deliver on some concrete outcomes. So, of course, ASEM, which has 53 partners with such divergence, that differences in background, right? You have South Asian countries, East Asian countries, developed countries, developing countries, and with such a diverse membership, which is hard to reach a consensus, right? So ASEM with such a diverse membership with divergent interests is very highly resistant to change. Especially when your decision-making process is consensus-based. To get all 53 to agree to change ASEM is not going to be easy. So I think even though the Chinese push hard to have this, and it was of course politely accepted into the agenda, but many, I think several ASEM members are quite contented to have ASEM continue as a forum for dialogue, right? And for the real, so-called real cooperation to take place in other appropriate institutions or settings. And since, like I said, ASEM operates on a consensus-based approach, what we ended up with regards to the connectivity agenda looks to me more like a reframing and repositioning of the current initiatives, and of course there are new initiatives, of the initiatives and meetings that were already taking place under the so-called, used to be called the 3 pillars of ASEM's cooperation, right? So you have the cooperation under the political security pillar, the economic pillar, and then the social cultural pillar. So it's just basically a reframing of this cooperation of these initiatives and meetings into what we will call now the connectivity pillars, or the areas of focus under the connectivity agenda. Yeah, and as set up by the ASEM Pathfinder Group on Connectivity, which was established, I think, in 2017 after the meeting in Ulaanbaatar in 2016. So the ASEM Pathfinder Group on Connectivity was established after the 2016 meeting, and of course came up with a very broad definition of connectivity that is acceptable to all in the ASEM process. So if I read you this formal definition of connectivity, I think it's quite a mouthful. So within ASEM, connectivity is defined as any activities or initiatives aimed at bringing countries, people, and societies closer together. It facilitates access and is a means to foster deeper economic and people-to-people ties. It encompasses the hard and soft aspects, including the physical and institutional social-cultural linkages that are the fundamental supportive means to enhance the economic, political security, and social cultural ties, which are the 3 pillars that I talk about between Asia and Europe, which also contribute to the narrowing of the varying levels of development and capacities. So under this connectivity agenda, various existing meetings and initiatives that I said has already started to take place, such as a meeting between transport ministers, custom officials on facilitating customs procedures, so as a way to facilitate trade, the meetings of education ministers, rectors of universities. All these are now framed under the connectivity. For instance, for the education ministers and the rectors conferences under the people-to-people connectivity, right? So this is how I see the connectivity. There's nothing really new to me in that sense. It's just a way of reframing and using this buzzword connectivity to make it more sexy. Of course, there's a new value proposition brought into ASEM by the EU following the publication of its own strategy on connecting Europe and Asia, and that was the emphasis on this level playing field that George mentioned. But the main thing was the word sustainability, right? And at the same time, the EU also makes public its strategy on at the same time as it's made public its strategy on connecting Europe and Asia, was also the launch of the ASEM Sustainable Connectivity Portal. So the EU has managed to use this ASEM forum to promote the narrative on sustainable connectivity. Of course, it did not face any pushback from other ASEM members, because talking about sustainability, again, is such a politically correct theme of our times that nobody will say no to sustainable connectivity. So this is my take of how this connectivity agenda is now deeply embedded into the ASEM process. So how should this connectivity agenda be pursued within ASEM? Where does connectivity in ASEM go from here? If we assume that ASEM will continue primarily as a top shop, one possible way for us to really if you're really serious about adding some value to this connectivity agenda, is really to focus on what discussions on connectedness and soft connectivity rather than the hard connectivity. I think in my panel discussion, I know the session was quite disruptive because the connections was not so good. But I did make a differentiation between what I see as connectivity and connectedness, right? You can have the state, you can have the physical connectivity that is good, but you don't have the sense of connectedness between the people, for instance. So I think what we can do is that to try and focus, for instance, because we know ASEM is going to continue to be this open-ended dialogue. Then I think because members do not incur any costs in terms of policy commitments in this kind of open-ended dialogue, we should really try to change it, at least to allow for far more frank exchange on emerging issues, especially issues that we have differences, right? Such as the new rules and regulations, or rules and regulations for digital connectivity, the framework for regulating digital trade, data security, etc. Especially emerging areas of new areas of that there are no existing or at least agreed upon existing rules. Then I think more emphasis should also be put on dialogue and projects in the people's sector that can bring about a deeper understanding of our history and cultures. We have, of course, a whole series of this dialogue of civilizations that has been promoted since 9/11, for instance. But I do think there's need to continue this kind of dialogue. But perhaps in some way, using the digital connectivity that we are now all forced to use because of the COVID-19, to create more online contents, not just the dialogue through Zoom, but to get universities involved, to get research cultural institutions involved, to create online contents that can be shared, that can be widely shared in the ASEM platform, to create so-called to develop dialogue, to develop a much more global a more open global mindset amongst the people of the ASEM member states. And I think in that sense, there's a lot of potential to me post-COVID to really focus and get ASEP. ASEP used to have these ASEM classrooms. And I think we need to focus on how we can create this kind of good online contents, because now there's a possibility that the contents really can, if universities work together, cultural institutions work together, this kind of online contents can be really easily can be accessed by a big section of the cross section of the people. And of course, this comes to even at this time when we have youths that are going to face massive problems with jobs and all that. Maybe the online content can even look into things like that look at mentorship, online mentorship and traineeship for young people and for young people really from Asia and Europe to understand each other's realities at home. You know, so through this online content, to get each other to understand what are the realities, the lived reality of each other's backyard or whatever you call it in their life. And I think this is one added value that I think ASEM can, and already there are some existing platforms that are there, and this is how we can add on to it, because you have, for instance, in the ASEM process already a ASEM education and research hub for lifelong learning, which is one of these key things that people have been talking about with in the fourth industrial revolution, with the digitalization and all that. And when things are changing so fast, you need to develop the lifelong learning mindset. For instance, you have the ASEF, like I said, has this ASEF used to have this ASEM schools exchange. So build on what has been done before, and some has dropped off the radar, and continue to build more online contents that are useful for creating and developing more understanding amongst the people of Asia and Europe. So I end here with my presentation.
Much, EEAS. That was terrific, because not only did you explain the background on the connectivity, but you have forward looked to have some new ideas. And I think this is what's useful about this particular session, is that we're looking not just to recount what happened in the past and recount the woes of today, but the way forward in the years to come, given the difficulties that we're all facing. So we have about five minutes for questions. I have not seen any questions yet come up on the chat, unless I'm missing something. Do we have some questions, please, from the floor about the Yayo's terrific and extremely detailed and forward-looking presentation? I don't think I'm missing a trick by not seeing anything. We're going to give you a minute. Maybe less than a minute. All right, so we've given you less than a minute, but nothing has come up. So I'm going to march on now to my very good friend Plamen. He's going to be telling us where are we all going to go, given COVID-19 when it comes to connectivity. So the title of his talk is The Future of ASEM Connectivity in the Wake of COVID-19. Plamen, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, George. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in the company of excellent scholars and very good friends. I'll try to put my slides on screen. Let me see if it will work. It's one of these tricks. Excellent. I'll try to quickly run through a list of emerging trends amidst the pandemic, and then speculate on how these possibly affect ASEM connectivity. I'll start with the bad news. It's true that as a result of the pandemic, Many forecasts paint a gloomy picture of the global economy, and of course this will affect the entire ASEM community. It will be affected across the board in all forms of connectivity, be it physical, economic, institutional, people to people, you name it. A quick V-shaped rebound is looking increasingly unlikely, we have to admit. To what extent there will be a rebound soon is still anybody's guess, and the pace of recovery will largely depend on the course of the pandemic. The volumes of trade between Asia and Europe will register a steep decline in 2020. Likewise, flows of foreign direct investment will be under severe pressure this year and are expected to fall sharply compared to 2019. The overall trend points to what has become trendy to be called shorter value chains, with diversification and reshoring turning into the new buzzwords, both in Europe and Asia. We know that there are calls for shorter and more diversified supply chains. Some governments are providing incentives to their companies to come back home or closer to home. Regionalization, as well as sub-regionalization, is likely to become more pronounced. There's a degree of rebalancing towards growth based on domestic and regional demand, and this trend is already manifesting itself. It's highly likely that COVID-19 will have a significant impact on transport between Europe and Asia, both for cargoes and passengers. It's already leading to reprioritization of transport modalities, with the aviation industry in a severe crunch and roads and railway tracks back in fashion. It's expected that while maritime connectivity will continue to account for a vast share of trade within the ASEM community, the Eurasian landmass is likely to grow in importance. An example which is very often quoted is that it takes 16 days to transport goods from Chongqing in China to Duisburg in Germany, whereas it takes 36 days on the sea route from Shanghai to Europe. Another likely impact of COVID-19 is the slowdown in the process of institutionalization of economic relations between the EU and ASEAN partners in Asia. For instance, right now, the EU and India have announced plans to set up a high-level dialogue on investment in trade, but the prospects of a free trade pact between the two remain uncertain at this stage. And above all, since 2013, the EU has held many rounds of negotiations with China over a comprehensive agreement on investment, but progress has been limited to date. In Asia itself, there's this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP Pact, that's being contemplated with a reluctant India, so it remains to be seen where this will lead. If I can move on to the next slide, please, Matteo. It should be the second slide, right, on pandemic-induced challenges. ASEM connectivity, of course, covers a number of other areas such as culture, education, scientific cooperation, and so on. In the area of culture, bilateral government-to-government agreements and ad hoc initiatives are more likely to be considered than ASEM-wide initiatives. And the volume of related activities is expected to be limited in the near future. That's my humble guess. In the domains of research and development and scientific cooperation, fiscal pressures are likely to take a toll on related budget lines, both at national level and in the EU 21-27 multi-annual framework. And similar developments are expected in many Asian countries too. In the area of health, a trend that's already emerging, and the pandemic is amid the pandemic, is the so-called vaccine nationalism, and an approach which I would call my country first. It's not unthinkable that the race for access to vaccines may trigger antagonism between ASEM governments. In the area of tourism, a huge industry which has been heavily affected, and it's also under the socio-cultural pillar of ASEM connectivity. It's likely that we will see some unpleasant trends for the time being. Because of the crunch in aviation, many millions of passengers now prefer shorter distance travel by car and railway within Europe and Asia, within their respective regions. Tourism on a national and regional scale in the next 1 to 2 years. With relation to climate change, the vast majority of ASEM partners are signatories to the Paris Accord. At the same time, the pandemic is putting strain on their economies, and particularly those struggling with the transition to coal-free energy sectors such as China, countries in South Asia, and in Eastern Europe as well. There are indications that the economic downturn, sorry? Everything okay?
There was a sound I was going to suggest to do a, but it's coming back now. Sorry for this interruption.
Okay, I do hope it's okay now. As I was saying, countries, some economies in Asia and Eastern Europe are struggling with their transition to coal-free energy. And there are indications that the economic downturn prompted by the pandemic has forced some governments to downgrade and even drop targets relating to the systematic reduction of carbon emissions. Ironically, while China's recovery would be good news for the global economy, it is likely to be accompanied by higher levels of carbon dioxide, even higher than before the pandemic. And basically, this is what President Xi stated a couple of days ago at the United Nations General Assembly. We will have to also acknowledge that there's the big elephant in the room, geopolitics. Hwee rightly pointed out that back in 1996, when ASEM was set up, the geopolitical environment was very different. Nowadays, we do have a lot of geopolitical tensions. Maritime connectivity in the hotly contested South China Sea is becoming a prominent trans-regional issue. The rise of Hwee in the United States and increasingly in Europe is yet another stark reminder that connectivity is hard to stay out of the geopolitical fray. There's a risk that we may see a splintered ASEM, splintered into two antagonistic spheres, which may curb connectivity. If I can move on to the next slide, please. Which should be on, yes, why waste the COVID crisis? While the pandemic is a shock to the world and a game changer, at the same time, not all consequences are necessarily bad news. There may be some opportunities hidden in these conspicuous challenges, and we should not miss them. This may be the time to ask ourselves what brings Asia and Europe together, and why they should stay together for the right reasons and on the right terms. For instance, the pandemic is already draining much needed financial resources at a time many ASEM countries badly need infrastructure. The expected shortage of financial resources is an argument in favor of multilateralizing ASEM physical connectivity through closer cooperation between hitherto competing visions. A concerted approach to large-scale infrastructure projects could ensure a much higher degree of efficiency and economies of scale. At the same time, limited travel amid the pandemic has allowed many residents of megacities in ASEM to rediscover the clear sky, an urban environment free of air pollution. This development may very well trigger a meaningful debate on environmental issues in megacities in conjunction with rapid urbanization across the entire ASEM community. Now, again, in relation to climate change, could it be that the pandemic has led to reduced greenhouse gas emissions? And if so, how long will this positive effect last? Sustainable economic recovery can only be based on clean energy transition and there are some encouraging signs. The expected shortfall of funding is likely to lead to a shift away from costly and risky transport infrastructure projects and a focus on other more sophisticated and cleaner forms of connectivity in the ASEM area. One of the unintended positive effects of the pandemic is that digital connectivity in the ASEM space has been significantly boosted since the outbreak. Travel limitations due to COVID-19 have shown that distance is back and have accentuated the need for telecommunications, thus giving rise to a whole new menu of digital services, say distance learning, e-commerce, but of course this will be Maaike's presentation. I don't want to be trespassing and stepping into her turf. So I'll move on to the next slide, please. Why reinvent the wheel? In making the most of these unintended, unexpected opportunities, we needn't reinvent the wheel. ASEM has come a long way since 1996. The concept of connectivity has been there since the 2014 Milan summit. So ASEM countries could fully utilize and invest more in existing structures already created in the ASEM framework. There have been these tangible areas of cooperation in the field of connectivity, TAC, which ASEM partners have agreed on. Let's update this list, this TAC list, in the context of the pandemic and its impact. There are ASEM standards for sustainable connectivity set out in the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure. In addition, sustainable connectivity should make the most of the greening and cleaning of China's BRI. President Hwee spoke about it in April 2019 at the Second Belt and Road Forum. There's also the ASEM Sustainable Connectivity Portal. We could add to it much more data, qualitative analysis, and all that, but it's a precious tool to be made the most of, to be fully utilized. There's yet another example. There's the ASEF Public Health Network, a participatory platform launched in 2009. It's been there, it's been very helpful amid the pandemic. Why not use and make the most of this structure? Hwee spoke about several platforms, very useful ones that we could definitely consider and build on. There's the ASEM Rectors Conference set up by ASEF and the ASEAN University Network. There's, of course, the ASEM Education and Research Hub for lifelong learning. There's the Classroom Network mentioned by Hwee. Why not use these tools? Let me move on to the next slide, please. And I'm getting very close to the end of my long speech. I think what we need is being earnest in ASEM, right? None of all these tools could be properly used unless we are earnest. I think that ASEM members should engage in a very well coordinated, evidence-based and constructive dialogue. There is no shortage of intellectual resources and tools or repositories that could back up tough political decisions with appropriate arguments. Let me move on to the last slide, what I call counterfactual scenarios. Let me give you the example of the Cost of Non-Europe report. Back in the 80s, there was this heated debate in Europe on whether or not we should move to a single European market. So the so-called Cecchini report presented basically two counterfactual scenarios. What would Europe look like with the single European market, and what it would look like without it? So there was a comparison of benefits and costs. And I think that we should have a similar exercise in ASEM. Consider the cost of non-connectivity or limited ASEM connectivity, and of course, full-scale connectivity. And then we can consider the cost of unsustainable ASEM connectivity and the benefits to be drawn from full-scale ASEM, sustainable ASEM connectivity. I'll stop at this point and we'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Plamen. A great tour of the force, if I may say. Centerpiece maybe of this particular session in terms of setting the scene, or the main theme of the conference, if you like. Okay, so plenty of meat there. And again, looking for people who may wish to come in with questions on that. While we're waiting for those questions to come in, I'll just say a couple of things. One is that an outcome of the summit that we hope to have next year, the postponed summit, ASEM 13. We hope to have a statement, a declaration on the post-pandemic socio-economic recovery. So we just had this five foreign ministers statement on COVID-19, so health related primarily. And now we're going to look at sort of the economic and financial consequences and what we should be doing about it. So watch this space on that particular issue next year. Secondly, Plamen mentioned also the ASEM Public Health Forum. Just to plug that next week, Cambodia, as host of ASEM, is holding a public forum on the issue of with the help of the ASEF public health body on falsified medicines, which is a big theme for Cambodia and in many places in Asia. So that's going to happen next week if you're interested in joining. So I'm waiting now to see if any of you have any questions. I think that Plamen said a lot of things, and hopefully there's some feedback from some of you. Thank you.
I can see a question on the chat, right? Relating to...
Yes, please go ahead, Plamen, because I can't see for some reason the chat. So please go ahead.
A big expansion of the... I think the first question relates to the expansion of the train system between the EU and Asia. I think it's already been recorded that the volume of commodities, goods transported by rail between Europe and Asia is going up, which I think makes a lot of sense, because the railway certainly has a lot of advantages, not least of all, it's much cleaner than, say, maritime transport. And then there's this question. Are young people flying less due to climate constraints? Well, there's this heated debate. I don't think we should be speaking about Greta Thunberg here, but I think that there is a degree of growing awareness of, the environmental cost, the environmental footprint, the carbon footprint of transport, not just aviation, but all forms of transport. And I think this is a meaningful debate, which should not go to extremes. But yes, the debate is certainly very useful. And there's another question about the new security dilemma concerning safeguarding online information. Yes, the security dilemma is there. I simply stopped short of commenting on it at length because Maaike will be covering that. All I can say is that there is a danger of having ASEM split into two antagonistic spheres because of security issues relating to the digital.
Anything else on the chats? Okay, so I'm going to just also compliment perhaps what Plamen said. When I was in Turkey, in the days when we used to move around in November, I read in the papers, I was actually doing a conference on EU-Turkey relations when it comes to Asia. And I read in the papers that the first Chinese trade arrived through the central route, arriving with great fanfare, having crossed the Bosphorus. And so, there's continual evolution of those routes taking place. And that was, I think, sort of a major landmark in terms of that. On the issue of Greta Thunberg, one of the things that I found which was really interesting is we're all very aware of her and what the message is coming from her. But actually, many people who are outside Europe have never heard of her, or outside Europe and USA have never heard of her. And so we think that there's this great awareness raising, and we have our, you know, and there is great awareness raising concerning Europeans. But you go to the outside world, and I was, for instance, put up a picture, and, you know, as a sort of a young leader, I was in Riyadh, actually, of all places, with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they're all baffled. So to say also that we must be aware that we have to do a lot of awareness raising across other parts of the world, because we think maybe these things are known and understood, but by Jove, they're not sufficiently understood. Anyway, having said all that, and
George, if I may, there's yet another question that I can see.
Okay, go ahead, please.
By Jesper Thompson, asking about the geopolitical tensions and the securitization of connectivity. He's saying that infrastructure is becoming a matter of high politics. This is absolutely true. I would say that geopolitics is the elephant in the room. We cannot really boost connectivity between Asia and Europe unless we talk about geopolitics and take it into account. I would say that infrastructure is indeed a matter of high politics. Interestingly, China says that the BRI is not a geopolitical exercise, and I'm not sure I can agree with this claim. It is a geopolitical exercise, and unless we acknowledge this, unless we talk seriously about geopolitics, I'm sure that we'll come across serious obstacles in terms of ASEM connectivity, at least in terms of physical connectivity. Again, I think the very last sentence will be that we need to have an evidence-based dialogue, as free of ideology as much as possible.
Good. Okay. So listen, some more questions are coming in. So I'm just delaying a little bit, starting the next session, just in case somebody else has a question. But we've had some good questions on this particular bit. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Plamen, do you see any other questions at this point?
Not in the chat.
Okay. Okay. Right.
Yes, hello from Leiden University, actually. I do work at the Clingendael Institute, of course, but today I'm teaching a course also at Leiden University on non-Western diplomacy. So I'm very happy, actually, to have a few students here that joined also, were asking questions. So I'm grateful for any questions, of course, from them and from others who have joined this session. I can no longer see any of the other panelists, by the way, but can you? No? Is everybody left now that I started speaking? Okay, anyway, so it's all me. That's all good, because I have excellent students here. And I'll be speaking on a topic that I think is very important in this content, in this context, I should say. Connectivity, we all have been speaking for a long time about roads and ports and railroads, but I think it's really time to move to the next big thing, and that's digital connectivity. So I wanted to start by sharing with you my thoughts what digital connectivity is, why it is important, and especially in ASEM context, how COVID-19 is impacting this field, and then finally a few suggestions on what ASEM could do with this topic, because that's, of course, in the end, what we should be talking about, Asia-Europe meeting, what's happening there, and what could be done more, taking it beyond the talking shop, as Hwee called it. And I think I very much agree with Hwee when she said we need a frank exchange on emerging issues, and that's what digital connectivity is. And there is ideology here, there is geopolitics in this topic, very much so. So I want to talk about the elephant in the room. I think it can be a pretty elephant also. It doesn't have to be a nasty one. So what is digital connectivity? I think that we can here distinguish the same three pillars that were mentioned before in the terms of the ASEAN Master Plan on connectivity, where we have physical, institutional, and people-to-people connectivity. In digital connectivity, we have regulation, so that's institutional. We have business, because businesses are the key players, so that's the people-to-people in business. And there's telecommunications infrastructure. We all know the 5G debate, and this is, of course, at the heart of digital connectivity's, telecommunications element. Since I cannot delve into detail on any of the issues here, I've mentioned them in this graph, which I hope is helpful for you to understand what we're talking about. And digital connectivity implicitly has been or was supposed to be discussed, I should say, perhaps, in ASEM also, when in 2018, the tangible areas of connectivity cooperation were adopted. Future connectivity and the digital economy was one of them. So that made me very hopeful that between ASEM countries, we were going to be discussing several of these topics that are highlighted here. But unfortunately, at least to the best of my knowledge, very little or nothing even has happened since then. And I think, Plamen already said it, without reinventing the wheel, let's go back there and see what happens if we can restart it. If there's any specific countries that don't wish to discuss some of these issues, then why not discuss them in smaller groups? I think that's also a way to take things forward. And that's not the perfect picture, perhaps, that we might want with connectivity. But of course, excluding somebody is not the case. It's just moving forward with the ones that are willing. And I think that perhaps should be an option also in ASEM context. Why am I saying that? Because indeed, there's ideology playing in here. There's norms and standards playing in here. And digital connectivity as the next great game is also, suffering from diverging approaches. And where do we see them most clearly? Talk about the internet. Do you take business interests first? Do you put national security interests first? Or do you take a human-centered approach? I think those are the three sort of divergences. And of course, the United States is not a member of ASEM, but United States companies, whether it's Google or Amazon or Facebook or Microsoft, they have huge presence in ASEM countries, all ASEM countries. So U.S. business interest and its business-oriented approach is impacting on ASEM countries. What we see emerging now is a focus on security interests that the Chinese government is putting, for example, in its approach to data protection, data sharing, where we don't see the individual, the citizens first, as the EU likes to put it, but where the state and the state's interests are prioritized. And this is, of course, a divergence that is impacting on all of the subtopics that we can discuss in the field of digital connectivity. So I think we have to be open and clear about the consequences of the different choices that these countries make for specific approaches, because they matter quite a lot. And we may have heard more about Chinese state surveillance, and I could say a few words about that. I won't, but I want to contrast that also with the United States so-called surveillance capitalism. In Europe, at least, there's more and more also pushback against the big power of big tech companies. I mentioned several of them already, coming from the United States, and that are gathering and mining and using data in a way that this fantastic book is labeled Surveillance Capitalism. So look up or pick up that book if you want to read more about this. But it's just as a way of saying that in Europe, yes, we take issue with some elements of China's approach in digital connectivity, and certainly the same goes for the US approach. So what the EU has been doing, and you could put this in the bigger picture of sustainable connectivity, that the EU has pushed more broadly. It's taking a human-centered approach. It's saying, well, the citizens, they need to have the transparency, first of all. They need to be, there needs to be openness, and they need to have a choice in knowing, deciding how their data are going to be used and managed. I think much of Southeast Asian countries actually agree with this approach. So there's actually interesting debates to be had here. Especially as the trade tech conflict between the United States and China is hardening. We see, of course, now this ban of TikTok and other apps. First of all, it was India, now it's the United States. But we also see in the 5G debates that there's increasingly more a standoff between these two big players. And the same will probably emerge in other, or could emerge, very likely in other elements of the platform economy, as it's called, where you also see in this very simple graph the dominance of United States and Chinese companies. So I think ASEM countries should also be talking about how to take things back in their own hands, develop more capacity of their own, and perhaps learn from the Chinese and from the United States in creating and maintaining these companies that can also then take things, will sell things online, will be facilitating contact online, and also, of course, will be gathering data, but in a way that is more sustainable, in a way that is human-centric, centered, I should say. So in the 21st century, those who control digital technologies will be able to influence economic, societal, and political outcomes. That's what last year Juncker's think tank put in one of their very interesting pieces. And I think that's something that we should all be aware of and that we should be discussing openly. Then, of course, as if this was not complicated enough already, and then came COVID-19, which in a short piece that I wrote, I think should label the first digital pandemic in terms of its origin and in terms of its effects. It's the first digital pandemic. And why is that important? Because calling it this is also highlighting some of the key challenges that I think we need to address. And I think ASEM is a good forum in which we can address this. So how do we shield from challenges coming from too much connectivity? I think actually that's one thing that was, an item that was put on the agenda with COVID-19. You could say that the restraints on digital freedom of speech in China actually caused the pandemic to change, to cross borders and to spread much more quickly than it otherwise might have spread. And as an effect now, as Plamen was already saying, many different countries are talking about reshoring, about diversifying supply chains. And of course, we have moved online. We've had to move online. So that's an effect of COVID-19 that is related to the digital, that makes COVID-19 a digital pandemic, and the origin is too. So again, ASEM should be talking about this, I think, and should be discussing what the consequences of all of this are. I just want to check if people can still follow me online. Okay, because I'm still wondering why everybody has left. So COVID-19 as a push factor in digital connectivity, the need to have digital connectivity on the ASEM agenda. And I think we need to invent new mechanisms for dealing with this. We know, of course, also the countries are moving to strengthen their industrial policies, including in Europe, where countries, including my own, the Netherlands, has been very, very hesitant to engage in any sort of industrial policy. We are now moving in this direction, and the consequences of it will be big. They will lead to different types of connectedness. So connectivity, more is not always the more the better, but we need to think about the modalities. And ASEM, as I said, I think is a good forum to do that. Two specific suggestions for ASEM's role in digital connectivity. One is to facilitate dialogue between governments, but also with the private sector, with big tech, but also with small tech companies that may be getting very big. And those are the online platforms and the e-commerce companies. Why is that important? Why do we need to have this multi-stakeholder approach? Because in the end, also issues of security, thinking about ethical ways to use technology, they must be done with companies there, because companies are the ones that are doing most of the research and development in-house these days. It's no longer the case as it was decades ago, that governments are sponsoring this fundamental research where new military technologies that are then used in societies are being developed. Now it's really within companies that fundamental technologies are being developed. So we need to engage with those researchers and with those companies to make sure that they are aware of how their technology is used and can be used perhaps in a different way from originally intended by certain states. And that debate you cannot just have at the very end of this lifespan, but you need to have at the very start, when already at the stage of research and development, before it is commercialized even. So I think ASEM can play a valuable role in bringing together governments and private sector representatives that will come from very different parts, very different cultures, and need to discuss this between them as early as possible. Standard setting is, of course, another hugely important topic, where also we see Asian countries in plural gaining ground. And here also, I think, before things or when things are discussed in international institutions like the International Telecommunications Union, where new standards for the internet are currently being discussed, ASEM can have a role in also bringing people together to discuss this in more informal settings. And perhaps we can look at the very successful DG Customs dialogue that has been ongoing in recent years. I think this has been, well, the people that I've been speaking to, at least, this has been one of the more successful elements of ASEM, where DG Customs, so the Director Generals responsible for customs of all ASEM countries, have come together every 2 years. And this is, of course, prepared by others. A technical issue, but one that also has very political elements, that has been very successful. I would suggest, why not also create that, for example, from Europe, it would be the DG Connect, the Director General for connectivity, if you will, or for digital connectedness, that could be the representative. And I'm sure all member states and all Asian ASEM members would also be able to send a person there to have those regular institutionalized meetings. A final suggestion, or a second suggestion, that I wanted to bring up for discussion now is a role for ASEM in what I like to call digital ODA. So that's digital development assistance, support to third countries on their digital infrastructure, on economy, on regulatory frameworks, on digital competence, not just skills, but also how to use those skills. So going much further, digital competence, and cybersecurity and resilience. That's a huge agenda where we see now that ASEM, many ASEM countries are already active. Of course, China's Digital Silk Road is one of them, but you can read here many other Asian countries and Europe's Digital for Development approach. But why waste this crisis and do the same as what happened with digital, with development assistance in some other fields, where countries are doing the same, and recipient countries just don't know how to deal or how to welcome that ODA. I think if we can discuss between ASEM members a bit better what is being done, and what norms and standards are being exported through this digital ODA, that we can bring digital ODA to a higher level for the benefit of those recipient countries. I'd like to leave it to George, because I think it's valuable to have time for discussion also. Thank you for having me.
And wonderful having you, Maaike, and thank you for one of the great things about this session is, there's lots of ideas. People are not getting, stuck in the rut concerning COVID-19. But the idea is, to be entrepreneurial, if you like, and use that opportunity, that negative, and make it into a positive as much as you can, and try and shift thinking, shift direction, and go in a different place, which is hopefully to improve things. Use that opportunity to do so. So anyway, Maaike, thank you for that, and also interesting thoughts about development assistance and digital. So I open the floor for questions, please, from everyone. So I have here one from Rizwan Togu. Many ASEAN member states like Singapore and Malaysia are facing a digital dilemma due to the ongoing geopolitical tensions between US and China, with both China and USA both being key partners in trade and technology. How much of a challenge is this to ASEM? Thank you. Have you got that?
Sorry,
Have you got that?
Yes, but I was trying to read the chat and listening to you at the same time. It doesn't really work. So let me read that question again. The digital dilemma. I'm not sure if Mr. Rizwan Togo is talking about ASEAN or ASEM, because ASEAN, I'm not quite sure what he is referring to. Of course, yes, this trade tech conflict between the US and China is a dilemma for all countries in Southeast Asia, as it is for all countries in Europe. And I think that's why, because we are sort of in the same boat together, that's why it's so important to discuss this between us, rather than and learn from each other's best practices. We know, of course, on 5G, on the 5th generation telecommunications infrastructure, every country will in the end make its own decision. Also in the EU, this is still very much well, at the member state level, that governments individually decide how to move forward. But the exchange of ideas on how to do this, for example, when I was in Singapore, is when I first heard about this differentiation between core network and the broader network, where you could actually be more securitized or have a higher level of security with the core networks, and then be more open to other vendors in the non-core networks. And I think that's an idea that many European countries actually borrowed from Singapore, just as they may have borrowed from Japan in how to not, of course, exclude specific countries, but to prioritize secure vendors. And I think that's one example where I can see that if we have more of that exchange ongoing, then it's probably to the best of, for better answers or new policies of all those countries. I'm not sure if I got the question right, but again, it's it was not.
Thanks a lot. Nevertheless, we'll march on. We have another question from Clingendael. And I don't know if you want to mute what I'm saying and read it for yourself. But COVID-19 demonstrates many weaknesses, e.g., the need for the public sector to take back responsibilities in terms of public services, utilities, e.g. health, production, masks, data ownership, power supply, etc. Will that affect the connectivity with Asia, pushing back the private sector? That's maybe also for Plamen. Maaike, do you want to try that first, or shall we ask Plamen to have a go at that one?
Well, I think this is sort of echoing what I said before. COVID-19 to me has also been an eye-opener in the sense that we should not be always aiming for more connectivity the better, but we should be looking at the type of connectivity, and then perhaps have prioritize less connectivity in certain instances if that better suits our purposes. So I think in that sense, yes, COVID-19 has demonstrated the weakness of too much connectivity, and we have seen a trend in Europe and definitely in my country also of the state coming back into some of these issues. The market does not always work in the way we had hoped it, because in other countries the market is not just the market, and that sort of different approach is entering now also Europe, and we have to respond to that. So in the consular field, for example, of course we see that the government has to take more responsibility as people travel more, people-to-people connections have risen, so also more people might get into trouble. So with the state retreating, this was actually the first sort of sector where you could see the public space, the public sector return. And now with COVID-19, we see it return also in the economic field in many ways.
Plamen, do you want to add to that at all, perhaps?
Yes, I will venture a very brief reply to this question. Not necessarily. I would say that the private sector does remain a key actor in the whole recovery process. Mind you, right now, very many private pharmaceutical companies are engaged in this race, towards producing a vaccine, right? Of course, they rely on public funding. So it's an example of, shall I say, public-private partnership. And then when it comes to infrastructure development, yes, there will be a shortage of funding, but this is where the EU sets an example by mobilizing private capital and guaranteeing, this investment through public capital. That's the key concept of the recovery fund in Europe, isn't it?
Good, excellent. Okay, well done, everybody. We're looking for other questions. Plamen, do you want to ask your question to Maaike, please? The one that you just
yes, I found Maaike, this idea of the coalitions of the willing very interesting. Perhaps you could elaborate on it with a couple of examples. Is there any specific area or any specific issue where this could be applicable?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, the tangible areas of connectivity cooperation also perhaps made a start with that when they put a lead country to each of the 5 areas that cooperation was supposed to be starting. But perhaps lead country does not mean that it's just one country and then others and then all should participate. I think that's perhaps the way that it was understood before. I would say with all 5 of those tangible areas of cooperation, have a lead country indeed that feels the most, or more than others at least, the urge to discuss a certain topic, perhaps also has more the capacity to facilitate dialogue on the topic, and then let the countries that are interested and that really wish to push this forward continue with the dialogue. And of course, that's a sort of a sensitive thing in an organization that perhaps wants to be open to everybody always. But I think the two are not really at odds with one another. Having a lead country and allowing, having others join is not saying that you exclude any country. But it is a way, and we see this also in the European Union, right? Where sadly, we need also sometimes coalitions to take discussions on topics forward. Why not also do that in ASEM? Because otherwise things just won't be discussed. At least that's how I understand that this future connectivity and the digital economy as one of those tangible areas for cooperation got stuck. is because not everybody wanted to discuss this or wanted to really have the discussion further. And that would be really a great pity because, well, it's just a really urgent topic to be discussed.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, and actually I'm going to, yes, I was about to bring in Yo actually, to say that you might want to make some comments. You may have a question, of course, but you may wish to comment on the practicalities of what's being suggested in the ASEM context, given your expertise in the subject. So over to you, Yo. Whatever you want to say, but also maybe that aspect will be terribly helpful for the meeting. Thank you.
I thought I'd just add to the discussion on this collation of the willing and the issue-based leadership, because this has been discussed in ASEM for a long time and actually has been in some way they have been trying to put it into practice, right? About clusters, looking at clusters of issues, because it's ASEM is such a diverse partnership with so many different members with different interests, and that has been recognized. And that's why we always say that ASEM is a place where you can really experiment with the different ideas, because it's, I would say, cost-free, it's low cost, and that's where we have been pushing. For those of us who have been involved in so-called review of the ASEM process, when it was in its 10th anniversary, the 20th anniversary, this has been one of the key aspects to try and make at least ASEM a bit more efficient and to be able to come up with some a bit more concrete ideas to move forward. And I think that was how this coalition of the willing issue-based leadership or functional leadership concepts have been used in the ASEM context.
Thank you. I'm just thinking if there's anyone else that may want to ask a question, or else we're going to wrap up. We've got 5 minutes to go, so we're pretty much on time, and thank you all for your great participation. But do we have any more questions? I asked once, I asked twice, I asked 3 times, no more questions. Okay, so yeah, so just to wrap up, to say it's been a great session. I think one of the things that we all should understand is that ASEM is not an organization with a secretariat and so on. It is a very loose body, which is based on meetings and people getting together, which is why this intersessional statement of COVID-19 was a bit unusual, but this is because COVID-19 allowed us to create something a little bit different and new, which is what we should be all doing. But indeed, we had the 15th anniversary, we had the 20th anniversary, and now we have the 25th anniversary next year. We can have another go, perhaps with new ideas and thoughts, looking at the past and seeing where we might project to the future. So I want to take this opportunity to thank our fantastic panel for the great work you've done, since the great inputs. Some of you are writing papers. We hope that those papers will be eventually published on the web on this particular topics. May I thank you all, and don't forget, because I almost forgot myself, that there is a coffee at 11:10 in which we can all get together and have a sip virtually. So 11:10 we can gather, some of us can gather and have a chat and further thinking about this particular subject. So I look forward to seeing you in about 15 minutes. Have a break and come back with your coffee mugs. All the best. Bye.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much, George.
Thanks a lot, George.
Thank you. And thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you.